During the winter of 2006, Ipswich in Suffolk was paralysed with fear. The bodies of 5 missing prostitutes had been found by police, sparking the biggest ever manhunt in the east of England.
He's targeting these women because they are vulnerable, because they are easy for him to access and easy for him to control.
As the horror began to unravel, it became a race against time to catch the killer. The police questioned over 2,000 motorists with no success.
He had to be caught because he wouldn't stop until he was.
Steve Wright, through this whole period, was sitting at home watching this whole drama played out on 24-hour news channels, thinking to himself, I'm doing this, I'm controlling this, I'm going to try and get away with this.
Steve Wright, the man dubbed the Suffolk Strangler, had earned his place as one of the world's most evil killers. Steve Wright is one of Britain's most prolific serial killers. In the space of just 6 weeks during the winter of 2006, he murdered 5 young women who were working as prostitutes on the streets of Ipswich. As the girls disappeared one by one, the world's media descended upon Suffolk. There was an inevitability with each breaking news report that another body would be found.
2 bodies have been found near Ipswich. This is breaking news and we're giving it to you as we get it.
But Steve Wright's story begins over 40 years before. Wright was born in the Norfolk village of Erpingham in 1958, one of 4 children. He grew up in a military family, living on RAF bases around the world with his father, Conrad, a retired corporal.
He's a normal child. I mean, no aggression. He's a typical boy that just wanted to play.
But family life was far from happy, and Wright's mother left when he was just 8 years old. Wright and his siblings stayed with their father, who went on to remarry.
Whilst he was living with me, there was never a problem. Never see one even. He was happy. He had little barneys, I suppose, with his stepmother at times when he weren't a bit mischievous, if you like. But it was nothing that you would sort of think about an hour later.
Steve was not a particularly bright young man, but cheery enough in his own way. Left school at 16 without any qualifications to speak of, and got a job working as a chef on the ferries which sailed from Felixstowe to the continent.
By the early 1980s, Wright had become a steward on the cruise ship, the QE2. And it was during this time he reportedly spent money on sex workers during trips to Thailand, which some experts believe may have altered his perception towards the opposite sex.
I think he's got an expectation of women. Women are there to perform a service for him, to play a particular role. They serve a function for him. And that's something that we continually see throughout the rest of his life.
He would often return home from sea penniless.
He was a bit of a loner, like, in a way. He didn't mix that much. But he did come out with me at the weekends, when he lived here especially, because he looked after the dogs when I had 2 then. A couple of beers down the end of the road, normal.
So Steve Wright was a performer. He was performing a role as a guy who was interested in playing golf and going to the pub and going on holiday. He appeared to be somebody who was normal, somebody who fitted in, but behind that there was something altogether different going on.
Wright married twice, but both ended in divorce, with rumours of domestic violence. He struggled to hold down a job and ran up large gambling debts.
I knew he'd put money on horses, because when he got his wage from the bingo hall, I used to take his wages off him, believe it or not. And I said, I'll give you enough to see you through the week, because I wanted him to build up a kitty to sort himself out.
Wright continued to gamble and was eventually declared bankrupt. Unable to see a way out of his debts, he tried unsuccessfully to take his own life.
For him to want to gas himself in the car, it must have been something that I was not aware of, for him to get pushed to that limit. You know, whether he was trying to befriend young females, I think the girls that he was getting, they were younger than him, and whether they, in the end, they turned him down and he couldn't face it or something, and he felt rejected or whatever. I don't know. When he was here, there wasn't a problem. Where did he get them? Did he get so much into debt that it pressurised him so much that he just broke?
I think Steve Wright's alleged suicide attempts are quite significant. So what does suicide represent? It represents somebody trying to get control back. Somebody whose life has kind of gone beyond their grip and they're desperately trying to reel that power back in. And I think for Steve Wright, if we look at some of his earlier experiences, this is somebody who came to crave control. He wasn't in control of his life as a child. The family were moving around, it was quite transient, it was quite chaotic. And as an adult, I think he felt an intense need to be in control. And that was what he was essentially doing here. He was internalizing, so he was being violent towards himself.
In 2002, while working as a barman, Wright, now aged 44, was arrested for stealing £80 from the pub till to pay off his escalating debt. This petty theft would later contribute to his downfall.
He'd been to court because he'd taken money from the till, but he kept that from me anyway. So again, if he can keep one thing from you, can he keep others?
By October 2006, 48-year-old Wright was living with a new girlfriend on London Road, in the heart of Ipswich's red light district. In the same month, 19-year-old Tanya Nicol went missing from her home.
She came round to mine about 8 o'clock at night, or something like that. And she wanted a lift home, so I gave her a lift. I didn't want to tell her off about anything, you know, but we knew, as far as I was concerned, she was taking cannabis or whatever. And I didn't know that she was into drugs so heavily, you see. You don't know. We just talked like friends. When we got there, she just got out of the car. One of the things I noticed was she just walked straight into the house, whereas, you know, you might turn around and give a little wave, but she just walked straight in. So I suppose that's sort of like this drug stuff, it dulls your senses to a lot of things. So it robs you of your life, really. And that was the last time I saw her.
The family was unaware that Tanya was living a double life as a prostitute to fund her addiction to heroin.
I didn't know that till afterwards. Obviously, she was doing that to feed her habit, isn't it? That's what I've been told, you know.
Before 2006, Ipswich, like many market towns of this size in the UK, experienced problems with drugs. We had a quite vivid and lively street prostitution scene. There was around, summer of 2006, we'd done some research and identified around 70 odd women that were working on the streets of Ipswich as prostitutes. The main issue, obviously, why they were out on the streets in the first instance, all these women were out there to feed a drug habit. They were all Class A addicts.
Another young woman working on the streets of Ipswich in 2006 was Jade Reynolds.
Every morning I wake up, you know, I have a heroin addiction to fund, you know, so unless you've probably saved money from working on the streets the night before, you've either got to lay there not very well for the morning and for the day. And then I'd get up at the night time, put on makeup and clothes and pretty much go and sell myself down on the street, you know. It was cold, dark, you know, very dangerous, but you don't think about the danger, you really just go out there and do what you got to do. But it wasn't a good lifestyle, it wasn't an easy lifestyle, really. There is a lot of emotion that go with it, and you either have to learn to switch off or let it overrun you, and heroin is an easy way to switch off all your emotions.
After Tanya Nichols' family hadn't heard from her for 48 hours, they reported her as missing. Police began to investigate, but it appeared she'd just vanished off the face of the earth.
We possibly thought she went with a load of people down to London somewhere and just stayed in a house or something like that.
Prostitutes go missing all the time, change cities. That's not unusual. Very seldom do they have many relatives who will identify their disappearance. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't.
As time passed, Jim became increasingly concerned about his daughter.
You're you're worried beyond, you just go out your head. You can't think straight. You're so worried. It really hits you for six. And I think after about 2 or 3 weeks, it was sheer hell, not knowing where she was. And by then you know that something's up.
While Jim waited desperately for any news about his daughter Tanya, on November the 15th, another young woman was reported missing. 25-year-old Gemma Adams.
For Gemma to go missing, that's when you worry, because Gemma would never go missing. She's not like that. She's always certain time, certain place, this, that, Yeah, so that was when Gemma went, that's when you knew something was wrong.
The police stopped nearly 2,000 people and over 500 cars travelling through Ipswich's red light district to see if anyone recognised photos of Tanya and Gemma. But they drew a blank. And it was a similar story when they spoke to the local sex workers.
You don't report every attack, but there's loads of times where we get people trying to steal our handbags or trying to accost us, because we're saying no to them, You are worried and you are scared, thinking, hang on, Gemma's gone now. I didn't know Tanya, but she's gone. Where are they? And you think, yeah, it could be me, I could be next, but I've got to go and get my money for my drugs, and you have to go out there. You have to learn to put emotions to the back of your mind while you're out on the street. I can then go home and be really scared, but if I was going to be scared that the girls are going missing, I'm not going to be able to earn the money for my drug addiction.
Then, on December the 2nd, 2006, the police got the call they'd been dreading. A body had been found in a brook on the outskirts of town.
Right on the bend, right on the corner, with her head this end facing upstream, her legs downstream, arms beside her body. Saw the hair flowing and the golden earring, and the head was on its side, and my immediate thought was one of the missing girls.
Tanya's father, Jim Jewell, feared the worst.
By this time, I concluded that she'd gone, quite honestly. I concluded that she was dead. That's what I concluded. Because by this time, she would have found her mother. Because she always phones her mother if she's going to be back late or anything. She was good at it.
But it wasn't Tanya. Police identified the body as that of 25-year-old Gemma Adams. There was no sign of a sexual assault, but her naked body had been dumped in flowing water. So finding any DNA evidence was going to be difficult.
When someone dies, then there will be all sorts of evidence on the body, in the body, that tells you all sorts of information. If you leave a body in running water, then the water will quite literally wash away evidence. Equally, the water will bring other things onto the body that can contaminate it. So you've got a double problem, really, of things being lost and things being brought to the body, which makes interpretation more difficult.
Unsurprisingly, the media was starting to take notice, including Paul Harrison of Sky News.
My boss said to me that I should go to Ipswich at the weekend. One body had been discovered. To him, something didn't seem quite right. He wanted me to get under the surface of what was happening in the red light district because we knew that 2 prostitutes had gone missing. So what was this all about? Was this going to be something bigger?
For a week, forensic teams scoured nearby woodlands for clues, and divers explored the brook. Then, just when they were about to call off the search, divers found another body. This time, it was Tanya Nicol.
Well, I think when I got the actual news, I can't remember my reaction, because it was something like, well, that's, you know, in my heart, I knew already.
Just like Gemma Adams, there was no sign of sexual assault, and the rushing water had stripped Tanya's body of any DNA evidence. Suffolk police called on Commander David Johnston from Scotland Yard, a homicide expert.
So I joined the investigation around the time the second victim body had been discovered, and that initially meant I went to Suffolk to speak to the chief officer team to assess the situation. I'm not sure I would say they were overwhelmed, and I think they recognised the need to bring additional resources in to avoid that situation, and that's what they did. And Suffolk, I know, had probably 100 to 200 people initially engaged in this inquiry. But that number quickly grew, and Suffolk suddenly found themselves, of course, at the centre of a huge incident with significant media interest globally.
So by the time they discovered the body of Tanya Nicol, we had already begun to spend a bit of time in the red light district late in the evening, early in the morning, just to see how prevalent prostitution was in Ipswich. And it wasn't difficult to find girls on the streets very late at night. We spoke to a number of them. They were aware that 2 girls had gone missing. We were almost delivering them the news that a second body had been found. We were almost telling many of these girls for the very first time that the body of a second woman, almost certainly a prostitute, and almost certainly Tanya Nicol, had been discovered in Copdock. Their reaction, they weren't fazed by it, it seemed.
It's scary every night going out on the streets. It's scary every night. You could get attacked every night, you know. To be honest, doesn't matter how scary anything is, really, you've still got to go out there and do it. That tears at your heart and you think, oh God, you know, what's happening? Who's next? You know? But even though you're discussing what if it could be me, you're still out there on the streets and you're still selling yourself because you still have a drug addiction to feed. You've got to put all them worries to the back of your mind.
Police were at a dead end. They had no clues and nothing to link the 2 murders. They watched hours of CCTV footage from Ipswich's red light district and finally found something of significance. Tanya had been caught getting into a dark car on the night of her disappearance. Could the driver of the car be the killer?
Hanford Road, Burnington Road, that was a place you would stand there, which went out at night on that corner. And they found footage of just a brief glimpse.
The CCTV was captured outside of a supermarket on London Road, the same street where Steve Wright was living. Unfortunately, the footage wasn't clear enough to reveal a number plate or identify the driver.
From my point of view, it's professionally very frustrating. The whole emphasis of our role is to protect the public, and we take that very seriously. And so each day when we're carrying out the investigation and trying to identify this offender, it's very concerning to us when we still don't have an identification made.
It had been 8 days since Gemma Adams had been found murdered. As the police continued with their investigation, they received some more shocking news. On December the 10th, just 2 days after the discovery of Tanya Nicol, the body of a 3rd woman was found in a woodland in nearby Nacton.
The 10th was a huge day, really. I had literally driven out of Ipswich for about 10 miles when I got a phone call from the news desk. And the blood really felt like it drained from my face, from my body, because shivers down the spine, we were now into serial killer territory.
I think it would be fair to say yes, there was extreme concern being expressed in Ipswich, not just amongst sex workers or women involved in that line of work, but across the whole of the community. This was a significant event, completely unparalleled, as far as I know, in the history of Ipswich and that area, which is normally a very quiet rural town.
We were now dealing with a serial killer, almost certainly, and also, whilst the national media, the UK media, were all over it by now, this is when you began to see the beginnings of the international interest in it as well.
Distinctive tattoos on the third body led the police to identify her as Annalie Alderton, who'd not been reported missing. She'd also been working as a prostitute in Ipswich. She was a 24-year-old mother of one.
She was a mad, kind of happy-go-lucky, crazy chick. You know, I lived in my first squat with Annalie. Really nice girl. I would say she's like a free spirit, you know. She's like, you know, great, like, I'm Annie, you know, this is me. You know, so she's kind of cool, like, to hang around with, you know.
The media's focus on Ipswich intensified even further.
I'd raced back to the scene in Acton where the body of Annalie Alderton was discovered. We knew very little at that stage about in what position it lay, but what we did know was that it was on dry land. And this was a twist in the story because the two previous victims had been deposited in water. So the police, for them, it was very exciting that in terms of DNA, this could be something that they could work with.
The autopsy showed that Annalie had been strangled and tragically revealed she'd been 3 months pregnant.
So the evidence that you'd see in a strangulation, you'd see bruising on and in the neck, you'd often see fine pinpoint hemorrhages in the eyes. These things really point you very directly towards that cause of death.
She'd been left in the crucifix position with her arms outstretched.
There is a tendency to want to attach a lot of meaning to that. Many people were looking at this as it unfolded, saying, well, there's some religious motivation here. But I don't think it was about that at all. It was about essentially getting attention. Even serial killers get bored. They want to mix things up a bit. They want to try something new.
The police still had no DNA, no clues, and no leads. The pressure to catch the killer was mounting.
There's always pressure because you have the media who are consistently requiring information because there's 24-hour media. They want to know what's happening. There's anxiety being expressed in the community. And of course the police themselves want to catch this man as quickly as possible.
I'm losing my friends. Well, I don't want to keep losing my friends. I don't want to lose my own life. You do think about stuff like that. It's not something that you don't think about.
The world's media descended on Ipswich and the cameras were all pointed at the police.
I think this case was one that attracted so much attention because it was unfolding in front of our eyes. This was the era of reality television when that started to become very popular. We were seeing it as it unfolded on 24-hour rolling news, and you never knew what was going to happen from one day to the next.
Detectives told prostitutes to stay off the streets, but their warnings were largely ignored. A local news crew interviewed one of the girls anonymously.
Why have you decided to come out tonight?
Because I need the money. I need the money, you know.
Despite the dangers?
Well, that has made me a bit wary about getting into cars, you know.
But presumably you will do that tonight?
Well, probably.
The woman interviewed was Paula Clennell.
Paula Clennell, she had children and she was always trying quite hard to change her life. You know, she was happy when saw her, you know, nice girl, but yeah, she tried quite hard, you know, to get out of it, you know, because it's a very hard thing to get out of the addiction if you still live generally in the same town. But yeah, she was trying, you know, to get away from it and change her life, bless her.
Just 6 days after that news report aired, Paula Clennell was missing. In December 2006, the police in Ipswich were under mounting pressure to catch a prolific serial killer. The bodies of 3 dead prostitutes had been found in just 10 days. They had no clues or potential suspects, and the killing wasn't about to stop. 2 more young women had gone missing. 24-year-old Paula Clennell, who'd been interviewed on the news just days before, and now police receive reports of a 5th missing woman. 29-year-old Annette Nichols, the best friend of fellow prostitute Jade Reynolds.
Annette was a girl for me that I was so humbled to know. You know, she always took time for me. She'd want to know if I was all right, if there's anything she could do. She'd do anything for anybody else. She was always well kept. She'd greet you with a smile and a happiness. You know, you felt all right when you was with Annette. I did. I could think, oh yeah, wicked, there she is, you know. It was a relief because I know that I could talk to her, she'd understand my problems. So when she went missing, that's kind of like tearing out a piece of my heart.
As the police searched for Paula and Annette, there was a macabre inevitability in the air amongst the mass of international journalists who'd gathered in Ipswich.
There was almost certainly going to be another discovery. Where was it going to be? Who was it going to be? It was nail-biting, and whilst it can't be described as fear, it was really palpable. You sensed that from the people in the town, you sensed it from your colleagues, but also from other colleagues from other media organisations and the police as well.
On December the 12th, another body was found in Levington, just a mile away from Nacton, in the same woods where Annalie Alderton had been discovered days before.
While somebody was out walking their dog, they stumbled upon the body of a 4th victim, just a few metres away from the main road in Levington. In the undergrowth, also this time not in water. Again, the DNA was important in this case. But what seemed quite strange about this one is that it almost had an appearance of a rushed approach, that this body was deposited by the side of the road, albeit a few metres off the main road. It had the appearance, or it seemed as if it had been done quickly.
The police sent a helicopter up to survey the woodland for evidence. As it circled the area, they made a further gruesome discovery. Another body was lying in the woods only 100 yards away. The naked bodies were those of the missing women, 24-year-old Paula Clennell and 29-year-old Annette Nichols.
I don't think I'll ever get back what I had with Annette, with another girl. You know, this is the most beautiful woman that I'd ever known, that had become quite important to me, that I could trust. You know, and now it's not there. I didn't go out after that. I was quite sensible, because I emotionally couldn't go out and work on the streets after Annette was found.
5 women had been murdered in Ipswich in just 6 weeks. The press had named the killer the Suffolk Strangler.
Alderton and Clennell, they were both asphyxiated. That was the cause of their death. In the other cases, the changes after death really prevented pathology giving a definitive answer, although I think it's reasonable to assume that someone who's killing 5 people in a short space of time probably used similar methods.
Interestingly, none of the 5 victims showed any sign of sexual assault. So it isn't a rape murder. It's not, oh, I've satisfied myself, now I'm going to kill you, murder. It is a targeted murder without a sexual element.
He is very much feeding off the media frenzy that's being created around his crimes. And he's increasingly feeling even more in control of what's going on. So he's changing the way that he's doing things, and he's looking at the reaction from the media when he does that, and he's absolutely loving it.
He believes he's fulfilling something. Maybe he's convinced himself that he's clearing the world of prostitutes. They're all dumped really quite close to each other. Demonstrates that he thinks he's doing something in his own fantasy world that is cleansing the world of evil, or cleansing the world of dirt, or cleansing the world of inappropriate sexual appetite. We'll never know. I don't think Wright probably knows now. All I do know is that he had to be caught because he wouldn't stop until he was.
On December the 15th, Tanya Nichols' dad, Jim Jewell, made an emotional plea for the killer to turn himself in.
Tanya has been taken by someone who needs to be found. We ask for anyone who knows this person or persons to come forward and contact the police.
With increasing pressure to make an arrest, police decided to question a local 37-year-old man.
He was identified because he had spent considerable time in a radio car talking to a radio journalist and other TV journalists.
I spent a bit of time with him to try and get to know his relationship with the girls. There was a kind of an understanding between them that you scratch my back and I'll scratch yours.
He was loosely associated as a friend of one or more of the girls who were murdered, and at that stage he became of significant interest to the inquiry. There was a very strong feeling from some of the media people present that this man was the right man and should be looked at more seriously.
With a suspect in custody, detectives received a lead from the forensics lab. The 3 bodies that were found on dry land did have DNA evidence on them. In a 1 in a billion chance, the DNA found on all 3 women was the same. But whose was it? The DNA was run through the national database and police got a match. But to their surprise, it wasn't the man they had in custody.
At that time, and as it still stands today, if a person is arrested or convicted of an indictable offence or serious offence, they can have their DNA taken and held on the database.
The DNA matched that of a local man who'd been convicted of stealing £80 from a pub till in 2002. 48-year-old Steve Wright.
And it was that match which led to significant additional work, including then the CCTV evidence which showed a vehicle being used by Wright moving between some of the locations around the relevant times. So he became a major suspect in the inquiry.
Over just 6 weeks, 5 prostitutes had been murdered in Ipswich. The police finally believed they'd found the killer, 48-year-old Steve Wright, whose DNA had been found on 3 of the bodies. Wright had not been a suspect at any point during the police investigation, even though he had been stopped during routine checks of the red light district. Whilst the world's media was focusing on a local man who police currently had in custody, Wright was put under surveillance.
Once the police had discovered the DNA, it matched Steve Wright immediately, although from a distance, making quite a brave move actually, not by arresting him straight away, but watching him, seeing his movements, what was he doing, where was he going, just for a 24-hour period. And ultimately, as we were all elsewhere looking at somebody else, another suspect, bang, they had made an arrest. They'd arrested Steve Wright.
It was a huge shock to Wright's father, Conrad.
I didn't believe it, simple as that. 2 people come to my door to say your son has been arrested, and I didn't believe it.
I think the only emotion that Steve Wright would have felt upon getting arrested was annoyance. This has stopped the media circus that I've been at the centre of. And I think also self-pity. Yeah, oh, terrible. Yeah, I'm now gonna be in prison, or I'm gonna be in a police station. I'm not gonna be able to do the things I want. He would never have had any kind of expressed empathy for his victims or their families, because they just didn't matter to him.
At the time, I split up with my partner, moved into my mum's house, and I woke up one morning with the world's media on my doorstep, to put it bluntly. And they said, "Did you know Steve Wright was like a client to your daughter, blah, 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 blah." And I didn't even know. My mum didn't even know, you know, but then it all came out, you know, that it turned out he's actually my first punter, which was shocking, you know, and I thought, oh my God, I was right with him right there, right then, you know, and yeah, I was kind of shocked, really shocked, to be honest, thinking that I was that close to him. Made me feel sick.
During 8 hours of interrogation, Wright made no comment.
The no comment at police interviews is indicative of that power and that control. So I have all of this knowledge and all of this information. I know everything about these crimes, and you want that knowledge. So I'm going to use this to my advantage. He knows everything that the police want to know. And is he going to tell them? Is he not going to tell them? That gives him a massive sense of control.
Although Wright didn't confess to the killings, on the 21st of December 2006, the police charged him with all 5 murders based on the forensic evidence they'd so far found. The other suspect was released from custody without charge. Prosecutors now began the arduous task of building a solid case against Wright for the upcoming trial. Michael Crimp was part of the legal team.
Of the 5 bodies that were recovered, 2 of them had been immersed for some time in water, and if there had been any DNA on their bodies, it had long since gone. And so in terms of DNA evidence, there was nothing to link Steve Wright with them.
Detectives impounded Wright's car. In it, they found fibres from a fake fur jacket owned by Annette Nichols, and more significantly, traces of Paula Clennell's blood.
Wright really didn't do very much to conceal his movements. He drove his own car. He dumped the bodies from his own car. He wasn't very forensically aware, as so many determined killers are these days. He didn't know about DNA and fibre analysis and trace and all the other things we've all become so familiar with as a result of television series and the rest. Wright pretty much did as he pleased and thought he could get away with it. And he thought he could get away with it because he thought that no one was going to miss a prostitute.
Forensic experts also examined Wright's home. They found the blood of Paula Clennell and Annette Nichols on a high-vis jacket. More conclusive proof that his encounter with the women had taken a sinister turn. But there was no link between Wright and the deaths of Tanya Nichol and Gemma Adams, the 2 women whose bodies had been found immersed in running water. Investigators re-watched the CCTV from the night Tanya Nichol went missing, and they were now certain the car that she got into was Wright's blue Ford Mondeo. Forensic teams painstakingly analysed microscopic debris found in the women's hair. Remarkably, they found fibres from Wright's tracksuit bottoms, sofa and carpet fibre from his Mondeo.
Both fibres in their hair and fibres on gloves and other items that belonged to Steve Wright clearly linked him to those 2 as well.
The game was up.
This was a case that involved a lot of experts and a lot of expertise, and what it came down to was that they were able to place fibres from the bodies at Wright's property. They were able to place blood on articles of clothing and in his car. We call it low cards exchange principle. You go and interact with somebody, you leave something of yourself there, and you take something away from it. And as clever as you may try and be, you're always going to leave evidence of that interaction.
Steve Wright was now linked to all 5 women. His trial began at Ipswich Crown Court on the 16th of January 2008. Wright pleaded not guilty.
To me, he looked pretty cool about it all. He didn't seem particularly emotive about the evidence as it was being put to him. Well, he had to explain the scientific evidence in this case, which linked him very closely with all 5 of the victims. And so his explanation was that he'd been in close association with all 5 of them, and obviously not long before they disappeared off the street.
Wright argued he'd picked up the women for sex, and that was why there was evidence of them in his car.
The defence were arguing that it might have been a coincidence, but no more.
But his case began to fall apart under intense questioning.
It was an odd picture that he portrayed because there was just too much coincidence in this case, that the evidence provided more than just coincidences, that it provided the evidence that damned him. We put to him various bits of evidence and said, well, was that just a coincidence? And to each question like that, all that Steve Wright said was something like, well, so it would seem, or it appears so. And he just couldn't deal with the questions that he was being asked about how all these apparent coincidences existed.
On February the 21st, 2008, after only 6 hours of deliberation, the jury found Wright guilty of all 5 murders, and he was sentenced to a whole life term. He was immediately sent to Belmarsh Prison. He will never be released.
I think the thing that's striking about this case is the speed with which Wright moved from being a relatively unknown minor offender involved in a minor theft to killing 5 women in a very short period of time. And I am strongly of the belief that had he not been arrested, he would have continued to kill.
This was a man who was desperate to be known, desperate to be someone. And by killing those 5 women, the notoriety that he achieved effectively made him into someone. We talked about the Suffolk Strangler. This is a man who nobody really knew. Suddenly everyone knew him. He was world famous for being the Suffolk Strangler.
I find it very difficult to call Wright a truly evil man. Deeply wicked. Deeply. With no sense of remorse.
To this day, he has maintained his innocence. He says he did not kill those 5 women. He goes even further to write to his father, who, in his father's eyes, he did what he did. And it hurts Steve Wright, actually, that his father doesn't believe him when Steve Wright says, "I didn't do it." His father looked in his eyes, turned and walked out of prison when he said, "Look into my eyes, do you think I did it?"
Well, it wouldn't make me feel any different whether I forgive him or not. I mean, the deed is done. And I'm, in a way, responsible for him being out there. You know, I brought him into the world.
Life will never be the same for the friends and families of those who were killed.
You know, I got to a resting place and stand and have a little conversation like you would, you know, and say I've come up to see you, dear, you know, and have a little bit of emotion going there, you know. But there you are, it's love, isn't it? It's always in our memory, of course she is.
Even now, 10 years later, I'm sitting here and I'm trying to be clean and I'm trying not to let my emotions get the better of me, but there's so many things that I see and I think, oh yeah, Annette would love that. I'll find it hard now, and I'll find it hard like 20 years' time, you know, that she's not here anymore. It tore a piece of me out that I won't get back.
Something positive has happened in Ipswich out of such a tragic turn of events. And that is, for me, is that there's no longer any street prostitution occurring in Ipswich. If I wanted a legacy for the 5 women, that would be it, that no other women have put themselves in such perilous and stark and dangerous situations.
I think Ipswich will never forget those terrible times, those few weeks in December 2006, where the world's eyes were on them for all the wrong reasons. And they will take the vital lessons learned during that period forward. They won't forget the women, they won't forget the girls who were killed, but they will move forward and try to not allow that period to effectively dictate their future.
We may never know why Wright carried out these frenzied attacks, or if there are other victims that have perished at his hands. He remains one of the UK's most prolific serial killers. For 6 weeks, the whole world watched in shock as the body count in Ipswich continued to grow. But eventually, the forensic evidence brought justice for the families of all 5 victims and put pay to the killing spree of Steve Wright, the Suffolk Strangler. On January the 2nd, 1981, 2 policemen approached a parked car on Melbourne Avenue in Sheffield, South Yorkshire, to talk with the couple sitting in the front. The officers had no idea they were about to arrest a man who'd murdered 13 women and evaded the authorities for over 5 years.
The relief that the man behind these horrible offences had finally been caught and was behind bars was immense.
Peter Sutcliffe, the man the press were calling the Yorkshire Ripper, had a cold-blooded MO. He was attacking helpless women with a hammer before stabbing them to death with a screwdriver.
The streets became quieter and quieter because on the horizon was this monster called the Yorkshire Ripper.
The whole of Britain was terrified by the elusive murderer who seemed to kill for his own enjoyment.
Peter, in my opinion, was a ruthless, cold-hearted killer who actually enjoyed going out and killing. He got a thrill, he got a buzz.
Peter Sutcliffe, the Yorkshire Ripper, had undoubtedly become one of the world's most evil killers. Peter Sutcliffe is one of the most infamous killers in British history. For 5 years he evaded capture while brutally murdering 13 young women across the north of England. It was an investigation with twists and turns and a case that still haunts the British public to this day.
For years, women and girls felt that simply leaving their homes at night meant taking their lives in their hands.
When Sutcliffe was eventually apprehended on January the 2nd, 1981, it brought an end to a manhunt that had both terrified and captivated the nation. The press had dubbed him the Yorkshire Ripper.
For women, it was a very frightening time, and they were stuck in this awful position of being told they shouldn't go out at night. It had an enormous social effect on the country.
As well as his 13 victims, Sutcliffe had attacked at least 7 more women. His arrest was a huge relief for the under-pressure detectives at West Yorkshire Police.
He attacked at random. We couldn't anticipate his moves. The whole of the north of England was held in a grip of terror, really, by this man. There was a sort of, I can only describe it as a Gothic-type cloud over the area.
But the Yorkshire Ripper's story begins over 70 years ago. Peter Sutcliffe was born on the 2nd of June 1946 in the market town of Bingley on the outskirts of Bradford, West Yorkshire.
He was the youngest of quite a large family. His brothers and sisters were all of strong character. They were all working class, could look after themselves. But Peter was a shy boy and very much attached to his mother.
His mother was somebody who was very much dominated and controlled by his father. So I think he had quite a lot of sympathy for his mum and he thought the world of her as a child. But Peter was somebody who was quite shy, quite awkward, he was quite skinny and scrawny. And I don't think he ever lived up to his father's expectations. And I think that planted that seed of shame in Peter Sutcliffe that would come to shape the rest of his life.
Sutcliffe's awkward demeanour as a child manifested into a dysfunctional adulthood, demonstrated in his early career choices.
Peter Sutcliffe had a variety of different jobs throughout his life. He worked as a gravedigger for quite a period of time, and it was reported that he stole things from the corpses that he was burying. Now that suggests to me that he wasn't horrified or repulsed by dead bodies, and that's something that would be quite influential later on.
On Valentine's Day 1967, 21-year-old Sutcliffe met Sonia Shermer. The pair began a long-term relationship, eventually getting married in August 1974.
The relationship that he had with his wife, Sonia, appeared to have been a decent one, and I think he would have treated her fairly well because she served a purpose for him. Women like his mother and his wife, he saw as carers and nurturers, people who would look after him. Other women, I think he saw somewhat differently. I think Peter Sutcliffe's view of women is very black and white. They are either Madonnas or they are whores. So they're either these perfect domestic angels or they're these sinful creatures.
These opposing views on women collided with one another when a family revelation dramatically altered 23-year-old Sutcliffe's world. His mother, whom he'd looked up to as a child, had been unfaithful.
His mother had had an affair with a policeman, and his father had decided to confront his wife at a hotel where she was meeting this particular man, and took Peter with him.
Peter's father basically humiliated her and said, look, I know all about what's going on. And the children found out as well. So I think this kind of further cemented ideas as to what women were, what could be expected of them, always to be cautious and wary of them.
I think there was every possibility that after seeing his mother and seeing what happened, that possibly preyed on his mind and affected his attitude towards women.
Sutcliffe began to visit the red light districts of Yorkshire and find solace in prostitutes. But his feelings for these women would soon lead to violence and eventually murder.
It's never been established precisely when Peter started his attacks. The first recorded one, or the first known one, was sometime in 1969 when he was with a friend called Trevor Birdsall. And Peter told Trevor that he was looking for a particular prostitute who owed him money. They cruised Leeds, and Peter told Trevor to suddenly stop the car.
He jumped out of the car, suddenly disappeared, followed her down the street and whacked her on the back of the head, and then ran sweating back to the car and away. The following day, the police came round and confronted Sutcliffe. He acknowledged that he'd struck the woman. He said he'd just given her a light blow with a hand. And because the woman was working as a prostitute, she didn't want any more problems with the police, and so she didn't go ahead with the complaint. Had he been arrested then, had he been listed as somebody attacking a woman in this aggressive way, who knows whether or not it would have been much easier to find him.
Whether there were other attacks between 1969 and 1975, nobody really knows, but his first real attack came in 1975.
By October of that year, Sutcliffe was living with his wife Sonia in Bradford and working as a long-distance lorry driver. On the morning of October the 30th, 1975, just 12 miles away in the Chapeltown area of Leeds, the body of 28-year-old Wilma McCann was discovered in a local park.
Wilma McCann was a Scottish woman who had come down to Yorkshire. She was working as a prostitute. She was very hard up, and it was very difficult for her because she had young children, young family to support. And I think that was the only way she felt she could get enough money.
The attack on Wilma McCann set in motion what would become a clear pattern and regular method of ambush by the killer.
His modus operandi was to use a ball-peen hammer and was to strike them very hard and very fast on the back of the head so they fell unconscious. He used his hammer and hit her over the back of the head, and then he stabbed her 15 times in the neck, chest and abdomen.
But the police were no closer to catching the killer, and 3 months later, on the 20th of January 1976, another woman was murdered in Leeds, 42-year-old wife and mother Emily Jackson, who'd vanished after a night out at her local pub. Emily's son Neil was 17 years old at the time. He remembers receiving the tragic news on that fateful morning.
I've come downstairs. My dad's loading one of the vans up for work, and I'm getting my boots on ready for going to work and having a pot of tea when they were knocking at the door and it opened the place. And that's when I first knew. And it was first knew when, like I said, for Dad, when the police knocked at the door. I can still remember it plain as day.
Again, a hammer had been used in the brutal attack. Emily had also been stabbed a total of 52 times with a screwdriver. Like Wilma McCann, Emily Jackson had been working as a prostitute to make ends meet.
It was just to help the family in dire straits, is what I've been told afterwards. When family were in hard times work-wise, she went elsewhere, but I didn't realise till well after.
This time, police were able to recover from the scene a key piece of evidence. On Emily's right thigh was a very firm and visible footprint from a size 7 Wellington boot.
For some inexplicable reason, he stamped on her thigh with such force that it left an imprint of the sole of his boot on her thigh. Now, police tried to trace that boot, or the manufacturers of the boot, which they did, and then try and find out people who had bought them, but it didn't come to anything.
Once again, the trail went cold. It was over a year until a murder with a familiar MO took place in Leeds. On the morning of February the 5th, 1977, the body of 28-year-old Irene Richardson was discovered. She'd been savagely murdered, another prostitute killed with a hammer. West Yorkshire police were suddenly dealing with a serial killer. What they didn't realise is that this was just the beginning of what would become one of the most infamous series of murders in British history. Less than 3 months after the death of a third victim, Irene Richardson, the killer struck again. On the night of the 23rd of April 1977, 32-year-old prostitute Patricia Atkinson became victim number 4. She was murdered in her own flat, this time not in Leeds, but in nearby Bradford.
She believed that if she invited customers into her flat, she was safe because all the killings had taken place in isolated parks or back alleys. So she thought she was safe, but she wasn't.
The killer hit Patricia 4 times around the head with a hammer and then mutilated her body with a knife. This time detectives found a clue to link the murders of Patricia Atkinson and Emily Jackson.
The police found the same boot mark on the bedclothes at Patricia's house, Patricia's flat, as they found on Emily Jackson's thigh.
This crucial link confirmed the authorities' worst fears. The killer was expanding his hunting ground and he seemed to have a favoured target. All 4 murder victims had been working as prostitutes.
They were very vulnerable women. It was very easy to persuade them to get into a car. It was very easy to find them, and they were used to not being protected in any way. And so he would be able to drive along, ask them if they were up for business, and they would get into the car. And he realized then that as long as there was nobody watching what was going on, he could do what he liked.
But the next victim would buck the trend and shock the nation. On the morning of the 26th of June 1977, just over 2 months after the murder of Patricia Atkinson, 2 children in an adventure playground made a gruesome discovery: the body of 16-year-old girl Jane MacDonald.
She wasn't a prostitute. She was a young girl going home, minding her own business. But suddenly, a schoolgirl was attacked, and that changed everybody's perception of the sort of man they were looking for.
By this stage, if it was a woman who was vulnerable, he was happy to kill them.
Any woman was vulnerable if they were found on the streets late at night.
This latest kill caused a great public outcry. Now, courtesy of the tabloid press, the killer had a nickname: the Yorkshire Ripper.
After Jane MacDonald's murder, the press then and television actually became more interested in what was happening.
You have to remember that nothing had happened like this since the Jack the Ripper in London in the century before.
What did become clear was the attitude of that time, because she was described in some newspapers as his first innocent victim, as though in some ways the prostitutes had been guilty of making themselves vulnerable to him. It caused a lot of anger amongst women, amongst feminists, and amongst any commentator with a heart. She was a victim who prompted the police to work much harder than I think they had been working at the time.
What this did in the public mind was actually create mass fear. There was a great deal of fear. And as the killings went on and the attacks went on, that fear increased on a monumental basis. Women were frightened of going out at night. Women questioned where their husbands were, boyfriends were, what they were doing when a particular attack had taken place and they perhaps weren't where they said they'd been.
The increased media attention in the case intensified the ongoing suffering of the victims' loved ones.
It was flashed everywhere. Don't matter where you went. Papers, TV, buses, placards, it was advertised everywhere. There was no way you could get away from it. It made it harder for me just seeing a photo of Mum of being not there to talk to her.
With a full-scale manhunt now taking place, West Yorkshire police were desperate to capture the Ripper before he struck again. But he was seemingly always one step ahead. His next murder would take place across the Pennines. On the morning of the 9th of October 1977, the heavily mutilated body of 20-year-old prostitute Jean Jordan was discovered on an allotment in Manchester. She'd been dead for over a week. This time detectives found an important clue, a newly minted £5 note in Jean's handbag, which led them to a 31-year-old lorry driver from Bradford, Peter Sutcliffe.
The police found the £5 note, they traced it via the banks, and found that it had gone through the hands of probably 300 people, one of them being Peter. Peter was interviewed, but on the night in question, he said he was at a party and members of his family confirmed that he had been at the party.
The police didn't know it, but they had found the murderer. It would not be the last time Peter Sutcliffe slipped through the fingers of the authorities. Between December 1977 and May 1978, he would kill 3 more women, all of them prostitutes, all of them bludgeoned to death with a hammer.
I think that the longer that serial killers get away with it, the more bold and the more kind of dramatic their offending becomes and the more prolific they become. Because they've been flying under the radar for so long, they may have even been interviewed by the police and subsequently not charged with anything. They do get to the point where they feel completely untouchable.
On December the 14th, 1977, one woman survived an attack by the Ripper, 25-year-old prostitute Marilyn Moore. She described her assailant in detail to the police and a photo-fit picture was released. By May 1978, West Yorkshire police had interviewed Sutcliffe on 7 different occasions, but continually ruled him out of the investigation. Lead detective George Oldfield's attention had been diverted elsewhere.
I'm Jack. I see you are still having no luck catching me. I have the greatest respect for you, George. But Lord, you are no nearer catching me now than 4 years ago when I started.
What really derailed the investigation, or largely derailed the investigation, was a tape from a chap in the northeast, from Wearside, who sent George Oldfield a tape which became known as Wearside Jack's tape, in which he said, "You haven't caught me, you've been looking for 4 years," and really taunting the police.
He mocked George Oldfield and said, "Your men are not doing very well. I've done another one and you still haven't caught me." And he had a Geordie accent, a Wearside accent. And as a result of that, the police discounted people like Peter Sutcliffe.
It had been almost a year since Sutcliffe had struck, but early on the morning of the 5th of April 1979, a woman discovered the mutilated and bloodied body of his 10th victim, 19-year-old building society worker Josephine Whittaker in Halifax. The Yorkshire Ripper's 322-day hiatus had come to a devastating end. In August 1979, West Yorkshire police would pay another visit to Sutcliffe's house in Garden Lane, Bradford. Officer Andrew Lapchew will never forget the day he stood face to face with the Yorkshire Ripper.
The reason for going to see Sutcliffe was because his vehicle had been sighted in 3 red light areas. In Leeds, in Bradford and in Manchester. Talking to Sutcliffe was like pulling teeth. You'd say to him, "What do you do for a living?" "I'm a driver." "Where do you work?" "Oh, clerks at Shipley." He wouldn't volunteer any information without it being asked from him. And one of our ploys, tactic if you like, an icebreaker, was to say to the wife, "Now's your chance to get rid of your husband if you want." Now, said jokingly, but it was an icebreaker to put everybody at their ease. With the Sutcliffes, there was no reaction whatsoever, which I found strange because at least you'd get a smirk or a laugh. He was quite an attractive man, well groomed, but had no personality, no charisma about him whatsoever, no aura, there was nothing there.
Lapchew felt so uneasy about his encounter with Sutcliffe, he submitted a report to his senior officers suggesting Sutcliffe needed to be investigated further. Lapchew was within striking distance of the forces most wanted.
I had the report typed up and I says, I've interviewed this fella, I don't like him. I says, I've got really bad feeling about it. It's an itch that I can't scratch. Anything to do with the case was attached to the report. And I went directly to Dick Holland in the incident room.
He put in a report to his senior officers that Peter was a person who should be of interest, someone who should be looked at closely. And one of the key things that Mr. Laptew noticed was that Peter had a gap in his 2 front teeth. And this, he felt, could mark up or marry up with bite marks found on 2 of the victims.
He asked me if it was a Geordie. I says, no, it's from Bradford, it's from round these parts. I says, but it's a dead ringer for the Marilyn Moore photo fit. And then he hit the roof. If anybody mentions effing photo fits to me, they'll be doing traffic for the rest of the service. It wasn't so bad that I'd had the report rejected, it was the manner of the rejection in front of about 50 people. So I could have crawled under the crack in the door after that tirade. But you've got to remember, these fellas were like gods. That's how much in high esteem we held them.
The senior detectives on the Ripper case were so convinced that the killer was the mysterious Wearside Jack that they dismissed any other suspects. It was a mistake that would soon lead to the deaths of 3 more women across West Yorkshire.
Police threw all their eggs into one basket and discounted a lot of others and spent many, many man-hours, days, weeks trying to track down Wearside Jack. And that threw the whole investigation into kilter. It really did derail it.
He'd had many escapes, Peter Sutcliffe, during the investigation. He was interviewed a total of 9 occasions. He lied his way out on every occasion, and he was a very good liar. He always had quite a clever excuse as to why he had been somewhere. He had the perfect alibi because he was a long-distance lorry driver, so he had a perfect excuse to be in different places at odd times of the day or night.
I think Peter Sutcliffe was rather amused by what was going on in terms of the manhunt for him. He'd been questioned by the police several times. He was right under their nose on multiple occasions. And even Peter Sutcliffe himself has said, I got to the point where I thought I must be invisible. So he got to a stage where he felt untouchable. He felt so powerful, he thought that he was never going to get caught.
As the police were trying to trace Wearside Jack, Peter then started killing again, and in September 1979, he attacked a young Bradford University student called Barbara Leach.
20-year-old Barbara was found murdered on September the 2nd, 1979 in Backash Grove, Bradford, only 200 yards from where she said goodbye to her friends after a night out. The women of West Yorkshire and the surrounding area were living in fear. Prostitutes were particularly in danger. 8 of the 11 victims had been working on the streets.
They were all very, very frightened. They needed to keep working. But there was always this fear that the next man, the next client, could be the Yorkshire Ripper.
He created fear and terror on the streets of West Yorkshire and Lancashire. He was somebody who was striking at night. Nobody knew where he'd strike next. It was absolutely terrifying for people.
The mood across the UK as a whole was stifled and tense, awaiting the next move from the man the public knew only as the Ripper.
We'd never had anything like it. The media coverage was overwhelming about it, so wherever you were, there was always something about the case. They had £1 million worth of publicity with the hoaxer's handwriting. On billboards, rewards were offered. It was a massively intensive campaign, really, both from a police point of view and a media point of view. And it saturated your whole life.
The problem for the police was the days of before computers. And police in those days would log information on index cards. Because of the notoriety of the attacks and the publicity, the police were inundated with information. They had boxes and boxes and boxes full of index cards, which filled an enormous room in West Yorkshire Police Headquarters.
There's been undue criticism of the police, who made every move with the best intention, with the information that they had. You cannot sort of anticipate what a murderer's going to do at random. All the stops were pulled out because all the police wanted, from the top to the bottom, was for this man to be captured so we could get back to normal everyday policing.
For almost a year, there were no more attacks until the body of 47-year-old civil servant Marguerite Walls was discovered in Leeds on the 20th of August 1980. She'd been hit on the back of the head, and in a change to the usual method of the Ripper, she'd also been strangled.
Ligature strangulation marks are often very characteristic. The ligature will compress the neck, it will often graze it just a little bit, and when the person dies, that area of the ligature mark will go quite yellow, quite hard, and it's usually very characteristic, something that will be identified very quickly.
Now, why he changed his modus operandi, nobody seems to know.
Marguerite Walls was Sutcliffe's 12th victim, but the police were still no nearer to catching him. A month later, in September 1980, 20-year-old student Mo Lee moved from Liverpool to Leeds to complete her degree. She immediately felt the change in atmosphere, having arrived in the Ripper's home county.
So in 1980, I just completed a foundation degree in art and design from Liverpool. So I ended up going to Leeds to do a fine art degree. But there was a strange atmosphere there. The streets became quieter and quieter because on the horizon was this monster called the Yorkshire Ripper. There'd be another murder and it'd be closer to home. And we began to realise that as women going out alone, we were pretty vulnerable.
Despite the continued rise in fear across the county, Mo and her friends felt an increased sense of unity against the unknown assailant.
There was a curfew almost on women going out alone. There was that solidarity amongst the women and female friends and the blokes as well, that they'd make sure that they would walk you home.
Mo and her fellow students were an independent group who tried as hard as they could to be unaffected by the events around them. But this would all change on October the 25th, 1980.
I planned to go into the town centre of Leeds to meet a group of friends from art school. And I left that pub, I think it was about 10:15, 10 o'clock. My friends were saying, oh, we'll walk you into town and you're all going to be all right. I'm like, for goodness sake, I'm absolutely fine. It's not far. I got to the outskirts of the campus and there's a church and you can either take the long way round or you can go through a shortcut street. I made a decision that it would be much easier for me to go through that shortcut and get into town, so get home safely.
But Mo was not alone.
It was fairly dark, and as I was halfway through, I heard this voice calling to me. So I stopped, and I turned round, and I walked towards this figure, and it was a young man. I thought, maybe I do know him. He was so friendly, so friendly.
But Mo was wrong. He was not a friend, or even a kindly stranger.
So I realised I didn't know this chap, and then I realised I was in danger. I just sensed this. And as soon as I started to run really quickly, his footsteps were behind me, getting quicker and quicker and quicker, and the fear, my knees turned to jelly. And all I remember was getting this massive whack on the top of my head, and I saw the ground come up towards me, and that was all that I remember. But it was real fear, like nightmare, deep, deep fear. I've never been frightened before like that, ever, or since.
Fortunately, Mo's attacker was disturbed when a group of students approached after hearing her screams. The next thing Mo knew, she was waking up in hospital.
I was pretty lucky. I think my bones are pretty strong, so the blow to the top of the head has left quite a large dent and crack in my skull. I had 2 puncture wounds to the back of my top of my neck, just below my skull, and cuts and bruises on my knees and elbows where I'd fallen to the floor.
The police could not be sure the attack on Mo Lee was carried out by the Ripper, but they wouldn't have to wait long before he claimed his 13th victim. On the 17th of November 1980 in Leeds, Jacqueline Hill, a 20-year-old student, was hit over the head, stabbed repeatedly and mutilated. An attack that bore all the hallmarks of the Ripper. But Jacqueline Hill would be Peter Sutcliffe's final victim. Within 2 months, a routine police stop would lead to one of the most sensational arrests of modern times, the capture of the Yorkshire Ripper.
Just after New Year, or January 2nd, 1981, Peter went to Sheffield and picked up a prostitute. On the same evening, a policeman with a lot of years of service decided to show a young rookie round Sheffield.
The two police officers spotted Sutcliffe's car near offices on Melbourne Avenue in Sheffield's red light district. They decided to approach and talk to the pair.
The cops asked, what's your girlfriend's name? He said, I don't know, we've only just met. And the policeman said, you know, I haven't just fallen off a Christmas tree. So he already realised there was something odd going on.
Peter said that he needed to urinate, and the officers let him go up to a wall by the side of the building. While he was away, the young police officer did a PNC check on the registration of the car and found that the plates were false. So Peter was arrested and taken to Dewsbury Police Station.
Once down at the station, Sutcliffe was searched. He wasn't carrying any weapons, but this time detectives weren't going to let him slip from their grasp.
So one of them thought, let's go back to that place where we spotted him and let's see if he did leave anything when he popped out of the car saying he was going to have a pee.
The police returned to the scene of the original arrest.
They found the hammer, the intended murder weapon, and they came back with them. And gradually after that, Peter Sutcliffe realised that the game was up, and eventually he confessed. And his only condition was that he be allowed to tell his wife, Sonia, before it became known to the general public that he was indeed the Yorkshire Ripper.
It had been over 5 years since the murder of Wilma McCann, but detectives finally had the Ripper in custody. All the years of terror for women in West Yorkshire, all the years of frustration for the police had come to an abrupt end. Andrew Laptew had suspected Sutcliffe may be the Ripper for the previous 2 years. He vividly remembers the moment a fellow officer told him the incredible news.
She came in and says, they've caught the Yorkshire Ripper. I says, what? Really? Who was it? She says, somebody called Peter Sutcliffe. Well, it was like somebody punching me in the chest from the inside. The bottom had fallen out of my world.
Sutcliffe's arrest made headlines across the country.
He is being questioned in relation to the Yorkshire Ripper murders. We are absolutely delighted with developments at this stage.
When Peter was caught, the press was all over it. At the time, it was probably one of the biggest stories since the Moors murders. The capture of Peter was front-page headlines and on top of the news for days, not only in Britain, but around the world.
His arrest was greeted with enormous relief. For 6 years, this man had terrorized a large portion of the country. The relief that the man behind these horrible offenses had finally been caught and was behind bars was immense. And that shadow that he cast over the country for those number of years passed.
I think when he was finally apprehended, he would have felt a sense of resignation that this was over, that he wouldn't be able to commit any more murders. But I think he probably would have been a bit shocked as well, because he'd been getting away with it for so long that I thought he'd just be able to talk his way out of it again.
A wave of relief spread across the country, but the announcement came as a shock to the family members of those killed.
I'd seen it on the telly when he got caught, and at first I couldn't believe it. When I started listening to it properly and realising, then I got confirmation through the police. Bit of a relief to say he'd been caught. People felt a bit safer.
Another viewer intently watching the story unfold was Mo Lee.
I was at home in Liverpool and his face appeared on the TV news. It was when he was actually taken from a prison van into a corpse, and there was really a good camera shot, and I recognised his face and his eyes. I actually fell to my knees. I was alone at home. It was 6 o'clock news. I thought, that's the man I chatted to. Then I was really horrified because it dawned on me that he had attacked me. So that was my first real understanding that for sure it was Peter Sutcliffe.
On the 5th of January 1981 at Dewsbury Magistrates Court, Sutcliffe was remanded in custody for the murder of Jacqueline Hill. Later, on the 20th of February, he was charged with all 13 murders and a further 7 attempted murders.
Once he'd been charged, I think Peter Sutcliffe felt that he had a chance of not going to prison, but of claiming to be mad, and therefore going to a secure hospital where life would be much easier for him. And so he emphasized the fact that he believed God had instructed him to clear the streets, and that it had been the devil, a devilish urge, had made him carry these things out.
The preliminary hearing began on the 29th of April 1981 at the Old Bailey in London. Sutcliffe pleaded not guilty to murder, but guilty to manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility.
The trial judge at that particular hearing heard evidence from 4 psychiatrists, 2 for the prosecution and 2 for the defence.
The judge stepped in and said, we need to be careful here because whilst I don't disagree with these psychiatrists, they're only going on what Peter Sutcliffe has told them. So we need to be very careful about accepting the word of a multiple murderer.
Mr. Justice Boreham decided at the end of it that Peter should stand trial in front of a jury on the charges of murder and attempted murder. And that's what happened.
The trial began on May the 5th, 1981.
The crowds had waited for hours, some through the night, to watch Peter Sutcliffe arrive from Brixton in the green prison van.
The 14-day trial was essentially a discussion about whether Peter Sutcliffe was, as Judge Mr. Justice Boreham put it, bad or mad. On May the 22nd, the jury had reached their decision.
As each of the 13 women's names was read out, the answer was the same, by a majority of 10 to 2, guilty of murder on all charges.
This sees the end of the largest murder inquiry in the history of the British police, and we brought it to a satisfactory conclusion.
I think when you look at Peter Sutcliffe's offending behaviour, he's somebody who's very much in control of what he's doing. Yes, his crimes are quite bloody, quite gory, they're incredibly violent, but he escapes, he gets away with it. He picks up again where he left off. He goes prepared to the crime scene. So he's somebody who knows what he's doing. He knows what he's doing is wrong, and yet he's still continuing to do it.
On the 22nd of May 1981, Mr. Justice Boreham sentenced Peter Sutcliffe to 20 life sentences and a minimum of 30 years imprisonment before being considered for parole. He was immediately sent to Parkhurst Prison on the Isle of Wight. Despite being declared sane at his trial, in 1984 Sutcliffe was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and transferred to Broadmoor Secure Hospital in Berkshire.
There's a real difference between prison and secure hospitals. So prison is a place for prisoners, for offenders. Secure hospitals are a place for people who are ill, who need treatment. A lot of people speculate that his paranoid schizophrenia was something that actually developed in prison. He was somebody who was vulnerable to this anyway, but because of the stress of the circumstances of being in prison, it triggered the symptoms in him.
In 2010, a High Court judge ruled that Sutcliffe's sentence should be increased to a whole life tariff, meaning he'll never be released from prison. And in 2016, Sutcliffe was moved out of Broadmoor and back into prison at Frankland in County Durham. He is, without doubt, one of the most infamous murderers in the UK.
Britain is not a country which has a reputation for serial killers. I think that's why it grabbed the public's attention to the degree that it did. 30 years after Peter Sutcliffe's killing spree, the world is very different. Very, very different. You don't see people walking about in the way that they did 30, 40 years ago. Nowadays, everybody's very cautious. everybody's worried.
I think Peter Sutcliffe has become this kind of iconic figure, this kind of criminal celebrity, and I think we need to be a bit cautious about that. We're going to lose sight of the victims, the people whose lives were lost in his killing spree. It's become more about him than it has about them now.
Sutcliffe's legacy casts a deathly shadow over the lives he took and the lives he left behind.
Peter Sutcliffe is never far from the headlines. You know, barely a few months go past without some mention of him in a national newspaper, and he is a notorious figure.
In the years since his conviction, Sutcliffe has admitted carrying out a collection of other attacks on women, including 2 back in 1975 before his first murder, Anna Rogulski and Olive Smelt. He's never admitted to the attack on Mo Lee.
Would it make any difference if Peter Sutcliffe confessed that he had attacked me? It just seems so unlikely. I've had to learn to live with the fact that that will never happen.
I just wish you were here. Because I had some good happy times with Mum. I just wish you were here. It breaks me heart knowing my son and my grandson don't see her.
Since his incarceration over 35 years ago, Sutcliffe has talked many times about his killing spree, regularly taking the opportunity to seize the limelight. But he's still yet to give a reason for the brutal attacks.
Peter, in my opinion, was a ruthless, cold-hearted killer who actually enjoyed going out and killing. He got a thrill, he got a buzz. Why he did it? Only he knows. He's never actually given a proper explanation. He's never given a cogent reason for killing in the manner that he did.
We may never know how many people Sutcliffe attacked or why he did it, but we can be sure no woman who crossed his path was safe. His reign of terror shocked the world as he evaded capture for over 5 years. The cold-blooded and brutal manner in which he murdered 13 helpless women is why the name Peter Sutcliffe, the Yorkshire Ripper, continues to haunt the British public to this day. On the 4th of August 2002, 10-year-olds Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman disappeared whilst buying sweets in the sleepy Cambridgeshire town of Soham.
They were so appealing, so beautiful, so charming, so smiley. The world and his wife wanted to know what on earth had happened to them.
For 2 weeks, police and locals desperately scoured the area. It was every parent's worst nightmare.
There was a sense of real fear and dread in the village. People were starting to get more and more desperate as to what might have happened to these 2 little girls.
Ian Huntley, a local school caretaker, gave an emotional interview to the press, appealing for the safe return of Holly and Jessica.
Somebody would have seen or heard something if somebody had tried to get those girls into a car, if it had just been somebody passing through.
But in truth, Huntley had brutally murdered both girls in the bathroom of his home.
Huntley was a bomb waiting to explode. All it needed was an opportunity. And on that sunny August afternoon in 2002, he found an opportunity.
Ian Huntley had, unquestionably, become one of the world's most evil killers. It is one of the most talked about crimes of the 21st century. The murders of schoolgirls Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman shocked the nation to its core. For 2 weeks, newspapers and rolling news channels brought a constant flow of updates in the search for the missing pair. When their bodies were finally found on the 17th of August 2002, the world mourned.
Out of an evening mist which had fallen on a remote patch of Suffolk woodland, the bodies of Holly and Jessica were taken away.
The killer was 28-year-old school caretaker Ian Huntley, a man who moved to Soham in 2001 to escape a troubled past. Huntley was born in Grimsby in Lincolnshire on the 31st of January 1974. He had a turbulent time at school and was often the target of bullying.
So I think this created a bit of a sense of shame in Ian Huntley, something that is often at the root of a lot of men like him in terms of what they go on to do. So he started off as somebody who was always the kid that was a bit odd, the odd one out, the one who's a bit of a loner.
In December 1994, Huntley met 18-year-old Claire Evans. They had a whirlwind romance and were married within weeks.
His wife, Claire, quickly found that he had a terrible temper. She later claimed that she feared for her life and that he would often put his hands round her neck.
Ian Huntley is somebody who is not capable of having a normal relationship with a woman, so he moves very quickly because he wants to maintain a sense of control within his relationships. So he will breeze into women's lives this knight in shining armour full of charm and compliments and will kind of try and wind them in.
Huntley's marriage didn't last long. His wife Claire had started a relationship with his younger brother Wayne. Despite the marriage being all but over, Huntley refused to grant her a divorce until 1999 to prevent their relationship from becoming official.
He'd always felt incredibly threatened by his younger brother. He took the attention away from him when he came into that family. And because of Ian Huntley's narcissistic tendencies, he's always going to feel he's being outdone by his brother.
While still married to Claire, Huntley fathered a daughter with a 15-year-old girl in 1998.
I think it would be fair to say that Huntley demonstrated throughout his adolescence and early manhood that he had an unhealthy appetite in younger and younger women.
Well, during his 20s, Ian Huntley preyed on a lot of young girls, underage girls, and the police who investigated the case thought that there were possibly up to 60 young girls that he'd had some kind of interaction with on that level. And he would kind of worm his way into these girls' lives. And they're younger, they're more impressionable, they're easier to lure in.
In 1998, 24-year-old Huntley appeared at Grimsby Crown Court, charged with both burglary and the rape of an 18-year-old girl. Both cases were dropped due to lack of evidence, but he was gaining a bad reputation across Lincolnshire.
He was insignificant little man who, on the surface, wouldn't say boo to a goose. Unfortunately, he had no conscience and would do whatever he wanted when he wanted to do it.
In February 1999, Huntley met 22-year-old Maxine Carr, and after dating for just 4 weeks, they moved in together.
She was naive, impressionable, and he was an interesting figure to her, I think. She found him, perhaps, I would hesitate to call him charismatic, but at least interesting, and did not discover the violent side to his nature that his wife had.
Maxine Carr was a very easy target, in a way, for Ian Huntley, because at this point in his life, he's managed to hone those skills of hooking women in, being quite superficially charming and manipulative and saying the things that they wanted to hear. So he's got quite a well-rehearsed script at this point in time, and he pulls that out when he meets Maxine Carr.
In February 2000, after a year together, the couple moved from Grimsby and set up home just 30 miles away in Scunthorpe. Their new neighbour, Marissa Gibb, befriended the couple.
Maxine and Ian were a lovely couple. Maxine was any 25, 26-year-old girl, bubbly, giggling, talking about wanting to have children. She wanted to work in a nursery and get a job and everything. She was fantastic.
And it wasn't long before Huntley's past was catching up with him.
I finished work at 8 o'clock at night, come home, and the next minute there was a police van outside in the back. And I looked out the window and thought, oh Christ, I hope everything's okay. So then they left. Next day I saw Maxine. I says, are you all right? Is the family okay? And everything like that. I says, no, Ian's been accused of rape in Grimsby. He says, but the dates they've got, we were living next door here. He says, well, why didn't you tell the police to come and see me? I verified that you moved next door. But then she said he was always getting allegations when they lived in Grimsby that he was raping this girl and done this to this other girl. That's why they moved to Scunthorpe to get a new life.
The couple rarely left the house, and Marissa recalls Huntley's controlling behaviour.
I went round to see Maxine for a cup of coffee. Ian was at work, and basically I had a cup of coffee, I put it on the table, next minute it was taken off the table, bleached, cleaned and put in the cupboard. I thought it was a bit OCD, but I thought it was just Maxine. And then she told me, no, Ian doesn't like to know that anybody's been in the house. So she was a bit scared of what was happening, and I was not allowed to tell him that I've been in the house.
Huntley's controlling nature would occasionally lead to violent outbursts.
My sitting room goes, you could see straight into their kitchen, and he was shouting at her, calling her all the names of son. You does your toe, you do what I tell you to do. You see her crouching in the corner where he was hitting her. You listen to me, you do what I say, you don't listen to nobody else. I'm your boss, I'm in charge of you, nobody else.
Despite the tumultuous relationship, in 2001, Huntley and Carr decided to up and leave once more and headed south to start a new life in the small Cambridgeshire town of Soham. 24-year-old Carr had found herself a job as a teaching assistant at St Andrew's Primary School, while 27-year-old Huntley was working as a caretaker at nearby Soham Village College. The caretaker's job came with a cottage for the pair to live in. Number 5, College Close.
I got a phone call of Maxine saying, we've moved in, the house is lovely, the countryside's lovely. I said, I hope you're okay, but if you ever need me, just ring me and I'll get my brother and we'll come and get you.
On Sunday, the 4th of August 2002, two of Maxine Carr's pupils, 10-year-olds Jessica Chapman and Holly Wells, were enjoying a barbecue at Holly's family home in Red House Gardens. The two girls decided to walk to the shops to buy some sweets without telling their parents where they were going. It was a decision that would cost them their lives. At 8:30 p.m. that evening, Holly's parents went upstairs in the family home to check on the girls, but they were nowhere to be found. They immediately raised the alarm. As dawn broke the following day, police began to search the local area with the help of hundreds of local volunteers. The media were beginning to take note.
Within hours of their disappearance, police from 3 forces and hundreds of townsfolk have joined the hunt for Holly and Jessica.
It is a small village in the middle of the Cambridgeshire countryside where it's one of those places where everybody knows everybody. So almost everybody in town would know the two families. They'd probably know the little girls, and therefore it was a community concern that these girls were missing and they didn't know where they were.
Later that same day, police issued a public appeal. They were becoming increasingly concerned for the girls.
Their disappearance is incredibly out of character. They haven't been missing before. Very well balanced, very bright young girls. As far as we can tell, they've taken no change of clothing and no money. So as we say, it's quite out of character.
The police had a very real belief that the girls could have just gone missing, that they could have wandered off and got themselves lost in the countryside. It was, after all, just a few hundred yards where they were last seen from open meadowlands and then the fens of Cambridgeshire and East Anglia. So it would have been perhaps quite easy for them to wander off, get lost, perhaps get into trouble, fall in a fen.
Police tried to track Jessica's mobile phone signal, but they couldn't pinpoint a location.
There was still hope that they could be found alive, and a worst-case scenario was that perhaps they'd been taken hostage by somebody or just abducted by someone with not good intent. So the police still, and I think the families and the people of Soham, still had a real hope that they'd see the girls alive again in those first few days.
On the 5th of August, Holly and Jessica's parents appeared at an emotional press conference to appeal for their safe return.
I love them so much. I just want them home.
Anyone who's got children must know what we're going through.
The disappearance of Holly and Jessica created a storm of interest, a media circus. They were so appealing, so beautiful, so charming, so smiley. The world and his wife wanted to know what on earth had happened to them.
The police based their headquarters at Holly and Jessica's school. Around 500 locals and officers from neighbouring Suffolk and Essex joined Cambridgeshire police in the round-the-clock search for the girls. It quickly became one of the biggest investigations the country had ever seen.
Not surprisingly, an absolutely extraordinary manhunt results. Police are drafted in, areas are searched, news crews arrive, reporters arrive. Everyone who's ever seen them is interviewed at great length.
With no real clues as to where the children are and what state they're in, searching these vast areas of fenlands is difficult. So these friends of Holly's parents have chosen an area close to the A10 Cambridge Road, where the two girls were reportedly last seen yesterday morning.
It's the helplessness, but as long as there's something to look for, we just never give up hope.
Well, it's been probably the worst night so far last night. We've had an experienced friends and family searching in ditches.
But the police had no luck. The search for Holly and Jessica continued for over a week, but it seemed as though they just vanished off the face of the earth. On the 15th of August, 11 days after the girls went missing, Sky News decided to retrace their steps, which meant interviewing the last person to see them, local school caretaker Ian Hunty, the boyfriend of Holly and Jessica's classroom assistant, Maxine Carr.
It's 6:15 p.m. The timeline on that Sunday night, the 4th of August, puts the girls here, right in the forecourt of the village college, the local education centre. We know they'd been to the sports centre just across the road a few minutes before to buy some sweets and were carrying on walking through what would have been very familiar territory. Their primary school, St Andrews, is just across the back of the village college here. How do we know they were here at 6:15? Well, we have an eyewitness. Ian Hunty here is a familiar figure. Evening, Ian. You're the school caretaker. The girls, Jessica and Holly, would know you, and they saw you on the front doorstep. What went on?
I don't know the girls. I stood on the front doorstep grooming my dog down. She'd run away and come back a bit of a mess. They just came across and asked how Miss Carr was, as she used to teach them at St Andrews. I just said she weren't very good, as she hadn't got the job. And they just says, please tell her that we're very sorry. And off they walked in the direction of the library over there.
And you may, as it turned out, have been the last person to actually chat to them before they vanished.
Yeah, that's what it seems like.
Huntley looked like an unassuming, ordinary little bloke with a soft voice who wouldn't hurt a fly.
He was a slight withdrawn sort of character, but at the time he seemed reasonably credible. It seemed like a credible story. That's where the girls would have walked. So when I talked to him, I had an open mind. I certainly at the time wasn't thinking, this is the guy that's done them harm.
Maxine Carr was also keen to appear on camera.
We interviewed her in the middle of the village and got her to tell us about her relationship with the girls.
They're ever so funny, they're brilliant, they're kind to everybody. They wouldn't say a bad word about anybody. And they love their families and everything, which is why nobody believes that they would ever run away. They was very close to all their family. This is something I'll probably keep for the rest of my life, I think. It's what Holly gave me on the last day of term. She was very upset, and that's the kind of girl she was. She was just lovely, really lovely.
In the conversation, we realised a few minutes afterwards, she spoke about the girls in the past tense. When I was talking to her live, didn't really occur to me, but a couple of minutes afterwards we said thanks very much and she walked off, and my producer said, just play that tape again. I'm sure she was talking about the girls in the past tense.
They was very close to all their family, and that's the kind of girl she was.
We thought, that's strange, and that certainly got our alarm bells ringing.
Huntley's unusual interest in the case and Maxine's TV interview raised suspicion among investigators. On Friday the 16th of August, 12 days after the disappearance of Holly and Jessica, police brought the pair in for questioning, while forensic experts began to search their home and Soham Village College, where Huntley worked.
It's a commonplace now, and indeed it was a commonplace even in 2002, for the police to take an intense interest in bystanders and onlookers at crime scenes. It's true in arson, it's true in murder, and indeed it is fairly familiar, and indeed even was then, that always look at who volunteers to search for a body, whether it's the body of a child or an adult. Often the perpetrator is among the searchers, not without exception, but often, because they want to admire their own handiwork.
Could it be the person responsible for Holly and Jessica's disappearance had been under the noses of detectives from day one? On the 16th of August 2002, 12 days after the disappearance of 10-year-old schoolgirls Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman, local caretaker Ian Huntley and his girlfriend Maxine Carr had been taken in for questioning by police. Interviews given by the pair on Sky News had roused the suspicions of detectives.
We were starting to think, wow, these two people really could be involved in something to do with these girls. They're close enough to it. They've clearly aroused police suspicion at this stage.
But after just 7 hours, they were released when Carr provided Huntley with an alibi. She claimed she was with him in their home on the night of the girls' disappearance.
It wasn't until about 10 or 11 at night that we heard that police released them, which we found interesting. And I got a phone number from Maxine Carr. I thought, well, worth a gamble, I'll just ring and see if I get through to them. And extraordinarily enough, I did. I got straight through to Maxine Carr. And I said, I gather you've been interviewed by the police. What happened? How are you? She said, well, we're fine. I can't tell you anything about it, but it's all right. Huntley then grabbed the phone off her and I guess wanted to end the conversation quickly. So he said, well, thanks for ringing. Yeah, we're fine. Nothing to report. The police have let us go. Nothing going on. Thanks a lot. Thanks for ringing. Bye.
Once Huntley and Carr had been questioned, further searches were carried out at their home and at Huntley's place of work, Soham Village College.
It was quite clear as we checked back that something had happened on the Friday night during the interviews with Huntley and Carr. It had triggered further searches, and because they suddenly saw Huntley as perhaps the key figure here, they went back over his territory, his home, and his workplace. And it was then that they began to find evidence that he had abducted the girls.
On the 17th of August, investigators got their biggest breakthrough in the case yet. In the bins at the school where Huntley worked, they found the burnt remains of 2 football shirts, tracksuit bottoms, shoes, and some underwear. Forensic expert Peter Lamb identified the clothes as those belonging to Holly and Jessica.
One of the crucial items in this particular case was the tops that the little girls were last seen in. These were unusual, and this helped us tremendously to build up a picture of the types of fibres that it would be easy for us to find.
Whenever two human beings interact, there is an exchange of material, be that something as tiny as DNA, up to something less subtle like a fibre, up to saliva or bodily fluids, blood. We leave a mark on each other, and no matter how hard one tries to destroy all of that evidence, there will usually be something left to say that two people have been interacting. There is this constant interaction of material that allows forensic scientists to draw conclusions and ultimately to come up with very strong evidence that places one person in one place with another person and builds the case.
forensic scientist Peter Lamb had the girls' clothes, but now he had to link them forensically to Ian Huntley. And it didn't take long.
During the examination of the items from the bin, I found 5 human head hairs. These head hairs were compared with Holly's hair and Jessica's hair. They didn't match either of those two, but they did match Ian Huntley's hair.
This vital evidence led to the arrest of both Ian Huntley and Maxine Carr on the very same day, the 17th of August, on suspicion of abduction and murder. When Carr had previously been questioned by police, she'd provided Huntley with an alibi, but she'd lied. She admitted that on the night Holly and Jessica were murdered, she was in Grimsby, 110 miles from Soham.
In the last few hours, a 28-year-old man and a 25-year-old woman have been arrested. The 28-year-old man has been arrested for the murder and abduction of Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman. The 25-year-old woman has been arrested for the murder of both girls. They have been taken to separate police stations in Cambridgeshire, where they will be interviewed.
Huntley and Carr's former neighbour, Marissa Gibb, was completely shocked.
When they got him as a suspect, I didn't think he would be that type, because he's always wanted children, and when my godchildren came round, or my niece or my nephew, he used to play with them in the back 10 foot, everything, and I didn't seem him to be the type to do them to the 2 young girls. It made me upset, really, because that could have been my godchildren, that could have been my niece or my nephew. He could have done it then, you know, kill them, but it did upset me, and for Maxine to stay by his side, that scared me a little bit, because I knew she's always wanted children. I thought, I'm glad they haven't got any children themselves. So what would have happened if they did have children?
And as the day went on, came the news the whole world had been dreading. Burnt human remains had been found in a ditch near an airbase at Mildenhall in Suffolk. The following day, August the 18th, the police updated the press.
It is with great sadness that I have to tell you the following news. It may be some days yet before we are able to positively identify the 2 bodies found at Common Drove near Lakenheath in Suffolk yesterday lunchtime. However, we are certain, as we possibly can be tonight, that they are those of Holly and Jessica.
A team of experts, including me, went to the ditch and we found that it was the bodies of 2 little girls. And it was then that we began to carefully excavate the area, looking for any clues who might have put them there and what had actually happened to them. Within the ditch, whilst we were searching, we found various items which led us to believe, even before we'd done any DNA testing, that these were the bodies of Holly and Jessica. In particular, we found part of the pocket of the tracksuit bottoms that one of them was wearing, part of the little plastic logo off the side of the tracksuit bottoms, and also a piece of jewellery which belonged to one of the 2 girls.
This isolated spot is about 10 miles from where the 2 girls disappeared, and for the moment the army of press from around the world covering the police inquiry are being kept well away.
When you're live on air, the thing is to keep broadcasting. I mean, the news that bodies have been found was dreadful, and it was all the worst we'd feared. But we knew that a lot of people had been following this story on air. Like everybody else, you know, your heart sinks when you realise the reality of it, but it's much later when you finally come off air that you kind of go, that's just awful. I mean, what a terrible, terrible waste, and what a terrible tragedy for this family, for those little girls, for a village that was really, really torn apart.
It was now officially a murder investigation. Forensic experts had to find as much evidence as they could, but the remains were badly damaged. If the bodies couldn't provide any clues, perhaps the deposition site may. But finding any small traces of evidence at the vast airbase was like looking for a needle in a haystack. To help hone in on exactly where the killer may have entered the ditch with the bodies, the police called on botanical ecologist Professor Patricia Wiltshire.
It's a strange place. There are a series of drove roads in this part. It's near Lakenheath Air Base. You're on the Breckland Sands there. That's the soil. When it gets wet, it gets very, very muddy and horrible. So what the farmers do, they get crushed up shells and they put them along a track. So as we drove along the track, it was all crunchy with shells, and then it stopped. And beyond that was the Breckland Sand. What is very interesting is that the girls were found in a ditch just where the shells stopped. The police were flummoxed, really, so they said, where did he enter the ditch? It was obvious to me because a lot of the nettles had gone through corrective growth. They'd been flattened, but they'd grown up and corrected themselves. And so I said to the police, well, here it is. And when they looked at that pathway, they found Jessica's hair on a twig. So they knew that's where he had entered the ditch. It's quite important because then they can do their fingertip searching in appropriate places.
Now investigators needed to prove that Huntley was the person who had deposited the girls' bodies in the ditch. Again, the surrounding environment at the deposition site held the key.
And when I looked at the burnt clothing, it had masses of evidence that matched the vegetation in the ditch. There were alder trees and all sorts of other things growing over the ditch, and there were alder fruits and pollen grains, all sorts of things embedded in the clothing that were from that ditch. And it showed that the girls were clothed when he put them in the ditch, so he must have taken the clothes off while they were in the ditch.
Further searches at Huntley's home revealed that his house and car had recently been meticulously cleaned. Officers who interviewed Huntley a day after the girls went missing also reported a strong smell of a lemony cleaning product coming from the house.
Not only did we examine the carpets, upholstery and items within the house, but we were also given the contents of vacuum cleaners that Mr. Huntley had access to. By the use of these vacuum cleaners, it's likely that some of these fibres would have been distributed throughout the house. So not only had they been removed, but also distributed as well. And so there wasn't just one particular location in which we found the fibres from the girls' clothing. They were found downstairs, upstairs, and in the bathroom as well.
We had quite a lot of exhibits from Huntley's belongings, but his car, he'd carefully changed the tyres, he'd washed it. What he forgot was that the chassis had picked up soil. The chunks of soil had the same profile as where he'd put the girls.
What investigators really needed was DNA proof that the girls had been in Huntley's house, but there was none to be found.
It was unusual not to find any DNA evidence whatsoever if the girls had been within Mr. Huntley's house. I now understand that it may be that Ian Huntley and Maxine Carr cleaned the house thoroughly using solutions of bleach. And that type of cleaning may account for the fact that no DNA was ever found within the property.
Prosecutors still felt they had enough evidence to convince the jury that Ian Huntley had abducted and murdered Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman. On April 16, 2003, Huntley pleaded not guilty at a hearing at the Old Bailey. It meant the families would have to suffer through a trial which was set for the 3rd of November. The whole world wanted justice for the two girls. Huntley was charged with the murders of Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman, and Carr with perverting the course of justice and assisting an offender. Both had pleaded not guilty. The world was watching. The lead prosecutor on the case Karim Khalil had received new information from the defence team.
The initial defence position, up until about a month before the trial, was that he had nothing whatsoever to do with the death of these two girls. About a month before the hearing, his position changed, and we were informed by his counsel that, in fact, he would accept that the two girls had gone to College Close, that they had died whilst in that property, and that he had taken them to the area which became known as the deposition site, where the bodies were eventually found. What we were not informed about was what Huntley would say about the actual death of the two girls and how that had come about.
The reason that I think Ian Huntley is so terrifying is because of this chameleon-like quality that he's got. He's able to roll out a performance to whatever audience he's in front of. So it's that ability to create that veneer of normality, that facade of normality. And I think behind closed doors, yeah, he really was a monster in the making.
On the 25th of November, Huntley spoke in court. He proceeded to give an extraordinary explanation of how Holly and Jessica had died.
Part of Huntley's story was that the first child had fallen into the bath, having a nosebleed. She had died without really any involvement on his part. And the second child, he had held around the mouth with his hand because she was screaming and he was anxious that others shouldn't be disturbed and to settle her down. And that was going to be his account. The suggestion by Ian Huntley that he didn't mean to kill those girls, I regard as preposterous. Two fit and healthy 10-year-olds. It just seems inconceivable that their death could have been caused by anyone other than a person intent on causing their death.
The prosecution argued that minutes before seeing the girls, Huntley had had a furious telephone argument with Carr as he suspected her of cheating on him. He then saw the girls, lured them to his house and killed them in a jealous rage.
We can only speculate about why Huntley killed the two. It's too horrifying to contemplate what might or might not have happened, and I feel that so strongly because of Holly and Jessica's parents. It cannot be anything but torture to imagine what might have happened to your daughter at the hands of Huntley.
Sky News presenter Jeremy Thompson, who'd interviewed Huntley and Carr on camera before they were arrested, testified during the trial.
I get a call from the police saying, yes, please, we would like you to be a witness in the murder trial of Ian Huntley. And so I've been in the Old Bailey plenty of times sitting in the press benches, but for the very first time I was in the witness box. It's intimidating being in the witness box, particularly at the Old Bailey, because it's got a venerable and weighty atmosphere. But then I looked down, there's Huntley looking up at me as well, with a fairly blank face, a fairly deadpan face, but who knows what he was thinking. He was probably thinking, I wish I hadn't done that interview with you. I might have given myself away, who knows.
I think for Ian Huntley, that interview on live television news was the high point of his life. He was absolutely loving every minute of this. He's completely 100% in control. Nobody knows what's going on. He's the only one who knows exactly what happened, and that makes him feel incredibly powerful.
On the 3rd of December 2003, Maxine Carr took the stand. She admitted she'd lied about being with Huntley on the day of the murder and was in fact in Grimsby. She argued if she'd known of Huntley's murderous actions, she would never have lied to protect him.
I think the media saw Maxine Carr as a bit of a target because she was employed as a teaching assistant. She was supposed to be somebody who cared for and nurtured and looked after children. You've got to remember, Ian Huntley was the one who carried out these murders. He was the one who made these decisions. And Maxine Carr, looking back on it now, it's clear that she was another one of his victims.
Huntley's defence was falling apart. Investigators had proved he tried to cover up his actions, and there was a vast amount of forensic evidence linking him to the girls.
We had a large number of transfers of fibres. We had fibres transferred from Mr. Huntley's clothing and his home to the tracksuit bottoms. We had hairs from Mr. Huntley transferred to the items of clothing of the girls. And in total, we had 154 transfers of one-way and two-way types.
It took the jury just 5 days of deliberation to reach a verdict. They refused to believe Huntley's explanation of the accidental killings. On December the 17th, 2003, Ian Huntley was found guilty of the murders of Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman by a majority vote. Huntley was given 2 life sentences by the judge, Mr. Justice Moses, and was immediately sent to Belmarsh Prison. 2 years after the trial in September 2005, it was recommended that Huntley should serve 40 years as a minimum.
I think Ian Huntley would like to think that he was a master manipulator, but I don't think he had the correct level of social skills to be able to get away with a crime like this. I think he became a victim of his own narcissism in the end. He literally just couldn't help himself in putting himself in front of the television cameras. So he was never going to get away with this, and I think he very much enjoyed his 15 minutes of fame.
Maxine Carr was found guilty of perverting the course of justice, but not guilty of assisting an offender. The court accepted that Carr had only lied to the police to protect Huntley because she believed his claims of innocence. She was sentenced to 3.5 years and immediately sent to Holloway Prison. In May 2004, Carr was released and given a new identity.
Well, I think she's a victim as well, because I think if she said anything, he would have probably killed her as well, and that's probably why she kept quiet, because she was scared of her own life. Her solicitor spoke to me and said, "Would you like to speak to Maxine?" I said, "Yeah," because she's a friend, and I was there through thick and thin with the Ian Huntley, and that I did speak to her a couple of times on the phone, and I wrote to her when she was in prison, and then it just all faded away.
It's been over a decade since the Soham murders, and one question still remains unanswered. Why did Ian Huntley carry out these senseless killings?
There's only one person who knows what happened, and because he chose to give the account he did, and has given no other, we will never be certain as to what precisely did occur. One only hopes that one day Huntley's conscience will allow him to tell us what really happened.
He kept himself together pretty well through nearly 2 weeks of investigation, of police interviews, of media interviews like ours. So he didn't fall apart, he didn't act crazy, he certainly seemed to know what he was doing in covering up a crime that at the time only he knew about it. And I would question those aren't the actions of a madman, just someone who's very cold and calculating.
Ian is so secretive, you will never find out what he did to the girls and why he did them, because he's like something in a ball, and he won't come out that ball. You'll never know. Till the day he dies, you'll never know what he did to them girls.
Huntley was able to leave his dark past in Grimsby behind just by moving away from the area. But as a direct response to the Soham murders, the Police National Database was launched in 2011, which transformed the way information is shared between forces across the UK. And a new child protection scheme was set up to help prevent such a tragedy ever taking place again.
Well, I think the most positive thing to come out of the case is simply that the government then tightened laws on employment with children. To work in schools or work in any areas where children are involved. Hopefully they've closed up the loopholes, so Ian Huntley, with his past record, which hadn't come to light, now that wouldn't happen again.
Huntley's house, 5 College Close, where Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman spent their last moments, was demolished in 2004. But for some, the memories of the Soham murders cannot be erased.
It still upsets me because I'm a mother, I'm a grandma and everything, and it's just the fact it could have been my family. Even though it's not your children, it's still mother instinct, it's children.
Cases like this are quite rare, and the thing that always sticks out is that children are involved. And this case, I think, perhaps gained more notoriety simply because 2 innocent little girls, 2 pretty little girls who'd gone out from a family barbecue to to buy some sweets and never came back. Anybody who had kids would have thought, oh, there but for the grace of God go our family. When it can happen in Soham, it means it can happen anywhere, everywhere.
For 13 days in August 2002, the British public went through a range of emotions during the search for Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman. From shock to hope and finally to sorrow. But over a decade on, it's important we remember the victims and their loved ones, not Ian Huntley, one of the world's most evil killers. 25 Cromwell Street in Gloucester has become one of the most infamous addresses in Britain. For 20 years, Fred and Rose West quenched their appetite for sex and murder inside this house of unimaginable horror. When police began investigating the disappearance of their daughter, it led them right to the west front door. Detectives were only just beginning to unearth the murderous history of Fred and Rose West.
It was on a scale that was really unprecedented.
Children are their things to play with. They are disposable. They're things there to be used and abused.
I've never for one moment doubted that Frederick West was a truly evil man. But he found in Rose the perfect sorcerer's apprentice.
This is the story of how Fred and Rose West became two of the world's most evil killers. Fred and Rose West are one of the most notorious couples in British history. For 2 decades, they sexually abused, tortured and murdered 9 women, including their own daughter, in their house of horrors. And between them were responsible for another 3 victims buried around Gloucestershire. When the news broke in February 1994, the media were only scratching the surface of the couple's terrifying life behind the closed door of 25 Cromwell Street.
5 days and nights into their excavation, and forensic teams have now unearthed 3 sets of human remains, all buried in separate places, 5 feet under the garden patio of this Gloucester home.
It's horrible to think that there are, dead bodies in a garden just down the road. It's just thoroughly disgusting. I mean, it's horrifying to think.
Totally shocking, especially around, in Gloucester. I mean, you wouldn't expect this to happen.
But Fred and Rose's horrifying story began many years before. In 1969, 28-year-old Fred West was married to his wife Rena with a young family of his own. But he had his eye on a 15-year-old girl named Rosemary Letts. Rose and her family had recently moved to the Gloucestershire area, whereas Fred was born and raised in the local village of Muchmarkle.
Well, Fred was the eldest boy in the family, and he was very much the target for quite a lot of abuse at the hands of his mother. So his mother sexually abused him, essentially, and he lost his virginity to her. And the family was a very self-contained one. Rose's childhood was similar to Fred's in many ways, in that it was completely dysfunctional and antisocial and abnormal. So she was abused by her father, who started raping her from a very young age. So what she took to be normal, what she took to be acceptable in terms of behaviour within a family really was anything but.
Fred pursued Rose. He was used to getting what he wanted. When the couple met, there was instant attraction.
Rose lived in the same village that Fred had a caravan. They met at the bus station in Cheltenham. She said that he could charm the birds off the trees, even though his appearance was shabby. He had not very clean teeth.
Well, these were 2 incredibly damaged people. They'd both come from abnormal families. And I think when they met, what they saw in each other was something familiar. So they both would have realised that the childhoods that they had were far from normal. But with one another, they felt that familiarity.
Maybe it was something that Rose gave off implicitly, but something in Fred connected with what had happened to Rose and the way she was and the way she'd been treated by her father. And it was like a union of 2 souls.
I think it was the perfect storm. The chances of these two people meeting was, it must have been a 1,000,000 to 1, but unfortunately they did.
By 1970, just a year after meeting, they were living together in Gloucester with Fred's stepdaughter Charmaine. His wife Rena was nowhere to be seen. Rose was pregnant with the couple's first daughter, Heather.
I think in the early days, perhaps the more dominant partner was Fred. He was older, he was more experienced, he'd seen more than Rose had. She'd come from this incredibly contained family. But I think as their relationship developed, she started to find her feet and find her confidence. And I don't think that Fred ever really trusted her.
For Rose and Fred, it was all about sex from the very, very beginning. Fred was the originator, but he found the perfect sorcerer's apprentice, the perfect partner, someone who shared his lust and someone who understood him and wanted to perform for him.
I think we have a lot of trouble making sense of Fred and Rose's relationship, and the reason for that is because we are people with emotions and normal feelings and ideas of what acceptable and unacceptable boundaries are around relationships. So I don't think I'd describe their relationship as a loving one.
Fred and Rose's traumatic childhoods had a lasting effect on the couple and their twisted approach to family life together.
It's always a very complicated question to answer how many children Fred and Rose actually had, because if you count Fred's daughter Charmaine along with Fred and Rose's 8, it's 9. But then you've got to add Rose's 3 mixed race children, all of whom were fathered not by Fred. All I would say is that all of them were deeply hurt, almost ruined by the parents.
I think Rose's early experiences within the family of being abused by her father wrote the script for what would later play out. So what she took to be normal, what she took as boundaries and rules really weren't going to work in